Okay, we are beginning the recording, and I'm not sure. There we go. Hi, my name is Christina Hardy, and this presentation is on the philosophy of evolutionary astrology. Before we dive into the philosophy, I want to give you I'm going to basically show you or describe a little bit about the teachers and a teeny bit about my experience that got me here. First of all, I really want to honor my teachers. I can't tell you how much I appreciate everything I've learned up to this point. And so the first thing I just want to mention is my first astrology reading was back when I was 27 years old. I had just completed my bachelor's degree in geology, and I knew that was not going to be my future. It was very disconcerting because up until that point, I was so passionate about the earth sciences and geology and studying and going on field trips and traveling. But there came a point, especially my senior year, when I bumped up against physics and calculus and integrating those two. And I just knew that I was not going to be able to compete in graduate school at that level. That really just took me over the edge. So I tried a few things out. I tried shadowing a teacher. As an introvert, I just realized that was not going to work. And I knew that working in the oil industry wasn't going to work. So I instinctively went to an astrologer, walked away completely blown away by how much she described me at that point in my life without knowing a thing about me except for my birth information. I actually listened to a tape of that reading for many years, probably about 10 years afterwards, about once a year, once every year and a half, to kind of I ended up learning and gaining more information every time I listened to it that I was just not ready to hear the first round. So eventually I moved on from geology, and I decided to go for my master's degree in transpersonal psychology. This was in 1992. And I loved my graduate studies were great. And at that time, I decided to formally study astrology on the side. It wasn't part of the graduate program, but I took it on the side. I studied with a small group of people. We met regularly, just loved it, couldn't get enough of it. Once I graduated with my degree, someone handed me a tape and it was of Richard Tarnas speaking about the passion of the Western mind. And after a while I was listening to the tape, I just kept feeling like, God, I don't know where he is. I really want to find out where he is. This is the kind of person, this is kind of information I would just love to study. At the time, he had not written Cosmos and Psyche yet. This was just after The Passion of the Western Mind. It was a couple of years after that. So, but I was in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area at the time. That's where I did the graduate school in the East Bay. I found out that he was in San Francisco at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and he was the chair of the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program. And I was just totally excited. After my transpersonal degree, I just felt like I needed to broaden my mind, kind of understand the history and the evolution of consciousness itself through studying the history, especially Western history, because that's what that program was. Anyway, I launched into the program. I was there for about 6 years. I was the program coordinator for the program for most of that time and loved it. As a subsidiary, this is not the reason why I went into the program, but once I entered the program, I found out that astrology was an integral part of the program. If any of you know Richard Tarnas, he wrote, I can never remember if it's Cosmos, yeah, I think it is Cosmos and Psyche. Oh, actually, we have it right up there, Cosmos and Psyche. He was actually teaching courses at the time called Psyche and Cosmos in preparation as he was writing the book. Anyway, I just fell in love with astrology for like a formal study. And it was an incredible gift being there for those 6 years to be studying and learning and to be part of a group, a community of people who are engaging, using the language of astrology and talking about, their Saturn return and their experiences with it and so on. So it was a very nourishing group of people for sure for me during that time. Now, I left because I actually fell in love with a man who was out in California, But at that time, a couple of years into it, it was about 2002, he's a professor of religion, had formerly taught at a public university in Northeast Ohio. And he, at the time, was working as a director for the Institute of Noetic Sciences. However, he decided he really missed teaching and decided to go back to Ohio to continue his teaching. And I decided to join him. So at that point, I finished all my studies, and it was good timing for me. So I traveled to Northeast Ohio, and suddenly I was looking at a humongous debt. I can't even tell you. It's embarrassing to say how much debt I had accumulated going to graduate school for all these years in a very expensive area, not to mention expensive graduate schools. So I decided to get serious and get working. I started working as a career counselor at the public university called Youngstown State University. It was a phenomenal experience. I learned a lot. On the side, I decided to, pretty much after I moved here, I decided to start a practice as an astrologer. Not doing too many astrology readings since I was working full time, but on weekends I'd do an astrology reading, probably once every second or every weekend. Anyway, not important. But what is important is that 15 years later, I decided to retire, take an early retirement from the university. I had fulfilled my loan debt at that point, and I was able to be free to do really what I was passionate about, and that is really being immersed in astrology and learning and growing through astrology. Along the way, though, there's one part that I forgot to mention, and that is that about 5-6 years ago, as I was studying charts, I got fascinated with the South Node, North Node dynamic. And I thought to myself, I bet somebody has actually recorded past life experiences and made correlations to the charts themselves. And so I did a quick Google search, and lo and behold, Patricia Walsh's name popped up. And she had recently written at that time, Understanding Karmic Complexes. And she had a book filled with she basically was drawing upon several thousand cases of regressions and comparing them to charts. So I contacted her. I actually entered her program. She's a deep memory process teacher. And for the next 3 years, just absolutely loved learning from her and the training program itself. But lo and behold, I didn't realize this at the time. Evolutionary astrology just went over my head. I was not connected to it at this point. But obviously, Patricia Walsh is an evolutionary astrologer. I never even noticed that part until I landed in the program. And suddenly I'm surrounded by evolutionary astrologers who were in this training program with me. And in fact, one of her co-facilitators was Kim Marie Weimer. So once I finished the deep memory process training, then I launched into studying with Kim Marie Weimer and Leroy Weimer, her husband. And for the next 5 to 6 years, embarked on an intensive study through the certification program, which I know that there are a number of certification programs out there. And I really highly recommend going through one because you learn so much through that intensive study. I don't regret a minute of it. It took a lot of time, but I really believe that it has served me in the long run for sure. So I have not personally met Jeffrey Green, never studied personally under him. My teachers were Kim Marie Weimer, and then also on the side, Patricia Walsh and Richard Tarnas. But a little bit, if you don't know Jeffrey Green, and I believe some people on this call may not know Jeffrey Green, or how evolutionary astrology came about. So for those of you who've heard this many times, please bear with me. This is just a real short description. So the origins of evolutionary astrology came from a dream that Jeffrey Green had in 1977. The entire astrological paradigm that measures the soul's growth and its evolutionary intent from life to life was given to him in this dream. So 7 years later, and after 7 years of applying the theory to his clients and seeing its correlations, he decided to write the paradigm in his book, Pluto 1. Let me get that highlighted here. So, oops, I don't think you see that yet. Yeah, there we go. So yes, Pluto 1. By that time, he had counseled over 15,000 clients and had seen the correlations through observation. That's a major phrase that is used frequently in evolutionary astrology, is observation correlation. So basically, everything is based on actual expressions of how we're expressing ourselves in the world and circumstances and our responses to the circumstances, and then observing how that is correlated to the chart. What are the archetypes that are being expressed at this moment? Okay, that really keeps it grounded in reality. So the fact that he had counseled over 15,000 clients at that point, I think is pretty significant, and had seen the correlations at that time. So one last thing, and I please apologize. Forgive me for mispronouncing these names because I'm not sure how to pronounce them correctly, but I'm going to give it a try. He believes that his dream came from his spiritual teacher, Sri Yukteswar, who was the guru of Jeff Green's spiritual teacher, Paramahansa Yogananda. Now, Yukteswar was also an astrologer. So schools have been established, a couple of them. One is evolutionaryastrology.net by Kim Marie Weimer. I'm showing that up. Whoops, I must have jumped over it, sorry. So anyway, she is right down here at the bottom. And also the School of Evolutionary Astrology, which is taught by David Green, Jeffrey Green's daughter. And then also Patricia Walsh, Rose Marcus, and Laura Nalbandian are starting a whole new school beginning this fall called Soul Wise School of Evolutionary Astrology. Again, I just want to emphasize how useful it was for me to actually go through the certification program. So I'm going to launch in and begin describing the philosophy of evolutionary astrology. So at the very end of this presentation, I will be definitely open to questions. And so please write them down as you go along or record them in your mind. The reason why I'm not taking questions as I go through is the way I teach is kind of circular, or maybe spiral, if you will, but I will revisit pretty much everything I say at least once or twice as we go through, adding a little more information each time. So probably your questions will be answered later, but if they don't, please ask at the end. Okay, here we go. So, I can't forget this. This is really important. Sorry. I do also want to acknowledge, thank, and honor. Watched a number of YouTube videos from EA Zoom meetings, and in particular David Green's, which has been used as some of the source material for this presentation, in particular the lunar tides, the moon, and evolutionary astrology. So if you want more information, more in-depth information about some of the things I say, any of these YouTube videos will really be helpful, and I'll refer you to them as I go along. Also, Kim Marie Weimer, of course, since I studied under her for 5 years and continue to do. And also, I will be referring to Jessica DeRuzza. She has a YouTube channel, if you will, called Trust Psyche, and I will be referring to her as well as we go along. So diving into the philosophy of evolutionary astrology. First of all, I just want to say that there is an intelligence embedded within every living being. I know I don't need to tell you this, but just want to put this front and center because this, I think, is the driving force. This intelligence holds a blueprint of our past and our future. The blueprint is programmed to unfold at certain times in our lives, just like a walnut seed eventually becomes a walnut tree, or a seed becomes a flower, or a fertilized egg develops into a unique conscious being. We see evolution occur in the cycles of the yearly seasons, just as we see in nature. It is a cycle of birth, emergence, flourishing, decay, and death, only to reemerge again as a being that is formed by its past and yet carries the vision of its future inside of its heart. We are programmed to become the highest possible version of the divine intelligence as reflected through our unique souls in this lifetime. And we can see this in the alignment of the stars at the moment of a being's birth, which are expressed in a blueprint of that person's birth chart. Now I'm just putting an image here of the solar system as a reminder. We use the planetary archetypes of all the planets, and this includes the sun and the moon, which I know astronomers do not use, but those of us who are very familiar with the archetypes, the planetary archetypes, the sun and the moon has a heavy influence on our psyches. So the story of your past and the blueprint of your future is wrapped up in the placement of the planets at your moment of birth. So here, this slide here is a snapshot of the evolutionary dynamic. Okay, I'm going to go through the pieces of it just to keep sort of the big picture in view here. And then I will be revolving around and going into each of the elements in more detail. So big picture view here, starting with Neptune, which symbolizes universal divine consciousness. Okay, as we see here, the ocean waters, and we see a wave rising out of the ocean. Okay, the ocean waters represent the archetype of Neptune, and archetypally, Neptune represents universal consciousness, which permeates everything in the universe, both physical and non-physical reality. It is the source of everything. It is infinite and it is pure love. In this image, it is the ocean water and the wave that rises out of the ocean waters, and the wave symbolizes Pluto. And this is a focusing of the conscious. This is the original desire of God, or if you prefer, universal consciousness, or source. I'll be referring to either universal consciousness or source as we go along. But it is the original desire to rise out of the infinite field of consciousness and to experience itself on a deep level as a unique consciousness. To do so, we choose to separate from the infinite consciousness. This is the original separating desire, which is the archetype of Pluto. The power of the wave rising out of the ocean waters is a beautiful metaphor for Pluto. I believe I first saw this being used about a year ago or so by David Green. And it just struck me as, yes, that's right, because of the power of the waves. And this symbolizes the power of the soul's desire to express its uniqueness in the world. Pluto represents many things, and I will be going through that in detail in a little bit. But at its core, it represents the power of your soul and your soul's original desire. Pluto holds all of the soul's history as it has risen again and again and again through, I would guess, hundreds of lifetimes to experience its uniqueness, and ultimately with the intent to experience its uniqueness as one with universal consciousness, in other words, divine source. But to do so, it recognizes that all beings are unique expressions of the one ocean. Pluto operates at the level of unconscious awareness, as it is seen in that we have forgotten our original connection to source, and in that we have forgotten the many lifetimes that we have lived and the thousands of choices that we have made that make us unaware of source. There is no fault in this. It is the natural process of evolution and coming to the awareness of separation from the divine with the ultimate goal of conscious awareness. It is our divine right, and yet we must choose to create that awareness and to manifest it. So in evolutionary astrology, Pluto is the archetype that holds the memory of the many lifetimes. Included in those memories are the memories of the wounds and the distortions that we have accumulated. These wounds desire to be healed. Evolutionary astrologers look to Pluto in the chart to see what are the archetypes of the wounds that a soul has incarnated with in this lifetime to heal. The purpose of the healing is the broadening of our consciousness, needless to say, and to become more whole beings embodied in this world. Okay, I will be talking more about Pluto in a minute after this slide, but before we get to that, the moon as symbolizing that which focuses consciousness and brings form to the formless on a subjective level. I have this at the edge of the wave because that is how, as our soul's desires emerge into the world in our moment by moment relationship with our experience is the moon as it focuses its consciousness. We project a self-image of the past that we brought into this life to orient ourselves. This self-image is an ego image that we have created from the many past lives that we have lived, and that provides security and comfort from previous choices and experiences. Obviously, it's not the whole collection of past life ego images, only those that we, from a soul's perspective, are choosing to evolve in this lifetime. Okay? So with the moon comes the south node, as I was just mentioning here, as well as the north node. The north node tells us what the projected ego self-image is that we are evolving towards. It is our soul's intention to experience in this life for our soul's expression to become more whole and empowered. Now the moon acts as a bridge between the security of the past and the insecurity of the future, because the future has not been, the waters have not been tested yet, typically. As we go through our life, of course, we're constantly testing them, but since it's new territory that we're evolving into, their insecurity is embedded within it. So we look to the moon's placement in the chart to help us to embrace the insecurity of the future and let go of the secure past, okay? So there's one other piece I want to say before I move on. This is very important, I think, for all of us to be aware of, because it's easy to forget. Life is not linear or static. As we gain experience with our north node and courageously embody it, we are simultaneously evolving the south node expression. You cannot separate the one from the other. So going into Pluto, your unconscious desires, and going into this into more detail here. So the first bullet here, the original desire of God to know itself, leading to the process of individuation. So Pluto symbolizes the original desire to rise out of the infinite field of consciousness and to experience itself on a deep level as a unique consciousness, as I've said. To do so, we choose to separate from the infinite consciousness. This original separating desire is the archetype of Pluto. It's just a reminder of this. This is the power, and truly the power of the evolutionary force, which I gotta say is just absolutely astounding as it rises again and again and again through our many lifetimes to experience its uniqueness, and to eventually, after many, many more lifetimes, to ultimately experience its uniqueness as one with universal consciousness. But to do so, it must become consciously aware of its wounds and its distortions, and to heal these in order to become a more whole expression of the divine in the world. With time, the soul learns to recognize that all beings are unique expressions of the one ocean. The singular wave, over time, accumulates experience, both strengths and weaknesses. Pluto shows us the archetypal themes of the soul that we brought in from previous lives to heal in this life. So, as an evolutionary astrologer, we look to Pluto in the chart as the archetype of the core desire of the soul and the emotional security patterns that prevent us from evolving. Okay, that's key. Our soul is the holder of the memories of these accumulated experiences, again, both positive and negative. But since the soul desires to evolve, it is non-static. The evolutionary force, in other words, Pluto, brings that which prevents evolution to the foreground in our life. So that when we look at Pluto in a chart as an evolutionary astrologer, we see those security patterns that have been created over time that prevent growth. These have become wounds and distortions because they are preventing our evolution. And when we help our clients or ourselves to become aware of the archetypal signatures of the wounds that a soul has incarnated within this lifetime to heal. So we see in Pluto the why of the issues. For example, Pluto in Libra, or the seventh house, or in Pluto in a stressful relationship with Venus, for example. Over time, the original love, Venus, becomes misplaced or distorted love due to emotional insecurity in relationship, or ultimately one's relationship with Source itself. Okay? Or Pluto in the second house, also ruled by Venus, but it's the second house archetype. It places the emphasis of accumulating false physical forms of security, for example, in order to replace emotional insecurity. Okay, these are just a couple of examples of how the archetype of Pluto's placement can give us significant information about the whys of the manifestations, in the insecurities behind the manifestations of the issues in a person's life. Again, Pluto represents the evolutionary force itself. So, and also as an evolutionary astrologer or any astrologer, we're always looking at the planetary relationships to Pluto, the sign and house rulers, the sign and house of Pluto, the sign and house rulers of Pluto's rulers and their locations, as well as the planets, as I said, that are aspecting Pluto, as well as their rulerships and the houses that they are located in. Okay, so it's always a large, it's whenever we're looking at Pluto, it's never just looking at Pluto, it's looking at a complex of relationships when we, as an evolutionary astrologer, are speaking about the Pluto dynamic. So embedded within Pluto is the evolution, how we're moving forward. So let me make sure. Yes. We're going to be looking at Pluto's polarity point here. Pluto has, okay, there we go. So Pluto itself has the information that determines evolution. Pluto also shows how to heal, integrate, and evolve the soul in this life through its polarity point, which shows us where we're going. Now, if you don't already know this, Pluto's polarity point is exactly opposite the placement of Pluto itself, okay? Hence the importance here for listening to and trusting one's desires rather than repressing them, because within the desires themselves, even though they arise oftentimes out of insecurity, they will have the momentum, the evolutionary intention as to where it's going in order to evolve. Okay, keep in mind that Pluto and its polarity point are at an unconscious level, and it takes Mars to activate the unconscious into conscious awareness. I will be talking about that in a little bit. But before I do, I'd like to describing the karmic dynamic, which is the south node of the moon and the egocentric resistances that it can describe. Okay, and that goes along with Pluto. Okay, and then I'll also be talking about the evolutionary attention, which is the north node of the moon with the Pluto polarity point, and the north node of the moon being the projected ego self-image of its evolutionary future, and then talking about the bridge between the two with the moon and Mars. So the evolutionary intent is the north node. Oops, I'm looking at a different slide on my screen here. Sorry, I just jumped past the karmic dynamic. Okay, starting with the karmic dynamic, very important, which is the south node and Pluto. Okay, south node gives us much information about how the wounds of the past played themselves out and the pattern of the karmic imprinting that is preventing us from moving forward. The South Node reflects the soul's desires of the evolutionary past in Pluto that were consciously actualized prior to this current life. It is the actual imprinting that was created from expressing the ego function over and over and over again. And because of this, this is the place of emotional safety and security, and thus within that, an intrinsic fear of change. We look to the South Node of the chart to see where the soul is picking up from the past. An evolutionary astrologer will look at the South Node placement, its house and sign aspects, as well as the planetary rulers of the house and signs and their house signs and aspects. So again, it's a complex of archetypes that get integrated when we're looking at a chart. Combined, these will give us information about how the karma was actualized prior to this incarnation and what typically needs integration and healing. So just speaking here, this is the karmic dynamic, and then the next slide will be about the evolutionary intent. And these two together are called the evolutionary dynamic. But I just finished the karmic dynamic part, now talking about the evolutionary intent, which is Pluto's polarity point and the north node of the moon. We evolve through the emotional body. And this is where we look to work with the client or ourselves that will help us focus on how to transmute, heal, and evolve the karmic dynamic. The evolutionary intent is found within the archetypes of Pluto's polarity point, and the North Node tells us what the new egocentric structure is that the soul will use to consciously actualize the current life's evolutionary intentions. Now, this is my favorite here, and my favorite image, using the moon as a bridge between the past and the future as we live moment by moment. I got this image from, not this literal image, but the metaphor from David Green, and it helped me to make so much sense of the relationship between the moon and its south and north node. So hopefully this will help you as well, okay? So, oh, and by the way, this information is in more detail in David Green's The Lunar Tides, the Moon in Evolutionary Astrology. Okay, and that's on the YouTube channel for EA Zoom meetings. So, when feeling insecure, look to the moon in your own chart or your client's chart to answer the question, how do I or my client navigate this moment, which is likely a projected image from the past, the South Node, that has very little to do with the present moment, and bring the present moment to its evolutionary intention, the North Node, okay? The moon shows us how we become subjectively conscious of the unconscious desires of the soul, in other words, Pluto. This is different from Mars, which is more akin to how we become objectively conscious of the unconscious desires of the soul. With Mars, we become conscious through action and reaction, or the yang dynamic of going after what we desire and actively creating what we desire. The moon is more like a bridge between the south and the north nodes. You look to your own and your client's moon to understand how to emotionally and subjectively stabilize the moment, hence the bridge, that will allow you to shift towards manifesting your moon's evolutionary projected image, which is found in the North Node. Okay? The moon is how we take responsibility for nurturing and stabilizing ourselves at the moment of stress as we take the steps to the unknown shore. That unknown shore intrinsically creates insecurity by its very nature of being new and uncharted territory. As we set our sights on the opposite shore, in other words, the North Node, we're being asked to muster up the courage to embrace the insecurity of the unknown of the opposite shore and take the steps to move forward towards the new territory or the new patterns of the North Node archetypal complex. Now, again, the Mars has a lot to do with this too, around actually activating and taking the steps. Again, the bridge is actually a great metaphor for the internal emotional security that is created each time that we welcome insecurity in the moment. Okay? Eventually, the inner security is strong enough that we can continue the individuation process to express our individuality in the world, and eventually an individuality that is in alignment with our soul and empowered by it. Again, I want to thank David Green for this metaphor. This has really helped me out a lot in understanding my own moon and my own nodal axis, as well as working with clients. The ultimate goal or intention is to align the ego with the soul through progressive union with the source. Or another way to say it is re-identifying the ego structure with the source rather than with itself. Okay, very important here. So Pluto, unconscious desires, as it rises and meets reality, as the unconscious desire emerges, we become aware, consciously aware through Mars, the archetype of Mars. There's a lot more to evolutionary astrology than I can deliver here, but this, to me, Mars is a very important piece to add to the moon and nodal axis dynamic. So this is because Mars is the leading edge of our desires. It is Mars that brings the soul's unconscious desires to conscious awareness through activation. As I've already said, as you know, Mars is the yang part of us. It instinctively acts to initiate our desires. That is when we become conscious of them. We can choose to act to fulfill further separation by moving towards the south node, by that Mars turning. We could be in the middle of the bridge over those that very intense chaotic stream and totally stressed out, and we can choose Mars to go back and activate the unconscious or the security patterns that we've done a million times before. Or we can choose to face and look to the north node, embrace the insecurity, and choose to manifest love. Okay, I got a quote here from Jeffrey Green about Pluto, and this is in volume 1. The planet Mars directly correlates to how we identify and instinctively act upon the desires that emanate from our souls. That is why in traditional astrology, Mars is considered the lower octave of the Pluto. In essence, Mars correlates to the subjective consciousness at an egocentric level that allows us to be aware of the types of desires that we have through action upon them. Also, as an evolutionary astrologer, we look at the relationship between Pluto and Mars to gain an understanding as to how long the core evolutionary and karmic intentions reflected in the natal position of Pluto and its polarity point and the south-north nodes and the respective rulers have been underway. Okay. That's a whole webinar on its own on phases and aspects. Both David Green and Kim Marie, and I'm sure others, have given webinars about how to understand the phases and the aspects within them, which I highly recommend because understanding the relationship between any two planets gives us such important information about that, the combination of that planetary archetype. In particular, Mars's relationship to Pluto. Okay. So moving on. Whoop, there's Mars. Sorry. Okay. Moving on. As we know, the soul individuating is as the individuation process continues. It's not a nice little pushing here, a little prodding there to form our individuated identity. On an emotional level, it is more like this, okay? It's the push and pull dynamic of individuation as we're rising into individuated consciousness or getting to know ourselves and getting to know ourselves consciously as an individuated soul. as well as the pull into the future, which is the return consciousness, the desire to return. Okay, so the desire to separate and get to know ourselves is all the time also working in conjunction with the desire to return. It's a simultaneous push to the past and a pull towards the future. It takes will and effort to move into the new territory that the soul is desiring to evolve towards, because it is unfamiliar territory. Again, you've heard me say this over and over again, but I am really just using here images to show the power of the soul itself as it is pushing us back and pulling us forward. But if we stay stuck in our past responses to life, problems arise because the soul desires to grow and to evolve. Once we respond by focusing on moving towards the experiences of our evolutionary intention, synchronicity begins to occur, and we truly feel empowered in our decision making. And even though we enter over and over and over again situations and experiences where we feel insecure, the more experience we have of embracing insecurity, the stronger our egocentric consciousness, or the structure of our egocentric consciousness, will be in order to move forward towards its evolutionary intention. Okay. So, a bit more about the challenge of the separating desires first before we move on to the returning desires. Separating desires. These desires can continue to manifest one's ego as separate. There's a point in the evolutionary trajectory where developing and building an ego that is separate is an essential part of the evolutionary process. So I don't want to fail to mention this, okay? This helps us in our journey, our evolutionary journey, through the consensus state, where, according to Jeffrey Green, is a state, 70-75% of the population. Okay, this is the state and the stages within it that is characterized by, and to quote Jeffrey Green, individuals whose identities are a mere extension of societal norms, beliefs, customs, and taboos. It is, in essence, a herd state where one does not question what they are told to believe or to think, and generally follow the herd. This is basically mainstream society, okay? Eventually, the soul desires to differentiate out. Now, as psychotherapists and as astrologers, we're oftentimes working with souls who are working with the differentiation process itself, to not lose their sense, their soul sense in the world, and to not compromise it, to strengthen it. Okay, but and the process involves getting to know oneself as an independent, individuated, self-actualized being. And so the separating desire can be very helpful in our evolutionary process. Okay, in certain parts of our life, in certain stages of our journey, it is the separating desires that are forefront. Okay. They're more prominent versus the returning desires. Although the returning desires are always also present, but it is important to have developed a strong, empowered structure of consciousness as one moves forward into surrendering to something much larger than oneself. Okay, I also highly recommend watching David Green's description of the evolutionary states found in the YouTube EA Zoom meetings, okay, where she goes into detail about each of the evolutionary states. That is also a whole webinar onto itself, and is absolutely fascinating. And it is very important when we're working with clients to really have a sense to determine which evolutionary state that they are in. We may not know which stage that they're in, but it's certainly which state that they're in by talking to them or having them answer questions prior to our astrological meeting with them. Because otherwise we could either just shoot right over their heads or shoot way below. So it's an important piece of information to have, and certainly to really understand. So, returning desires, and as I've said it many times here, it is the desire to return to source, the source being divine consciousness, or as represented in this image here, the sea, without losing its identity, okay? But prior to taking responsibility for manifesting the divine source as embodied in form, in our different stages, it is experienced as the desire to return to the mother's womb or her breast, where all the nourishment for our life is found in her milk, and to return to the father figure who protects, supports, and fights for us. As we are developing as children, we emotionally need the mother-father archetype to develop a strong emotional, physical support system. When we didn't receive it in our childhood development, we seek it outside of ourselves in adult life, okay? Whether we're projecting the ideal mother or the ideal father archetype onto our love partners or our teachers or gurus or politicians or institutions, the list goes on, okay? Eventually in our soul's history, and as many of us in this webinar are aware, have experienced, is the non-ideal mother and father. Regardless of whether this was the mother or father's fault, it is ultimately our spiritual push to evolve to a more conscious relationship with the divine by taking responsibility for ourselves and a responsibility for developing our relationship with the divine itself. This process requires surrendering the personal will to the divine will and to allow our relationship with it to guide and move us in order to experience ultimate support. Of course, this is the ideal. All of us will go through one form or another of relying on superficial external sources of support. And that is how, when we're confronted with those external sources of support, either draining our energy or making us miserable, so on and so on, we are asked to turn inward and learn how to develop the support within ourselves. Okay, so rather than relying on drugs, alcohol, food, TV as a replacement for the ideal mother, or projecting onto others the expectation that they will take care of us or support us as a replacement for the ideal father, we're being asked to turn inward and to learn to our consciousness, to turn it inward, to develop it ourselves, okay? Again, the ultimate goal or intention is to align the ego with the soul through progressive union with the source and re-identifying the ego with the source rather than with itself. However, as we all know, the process of letting go and moving forward is intense. Emotionally, it's more akin to trials by fire, especially these days when most of us are in, right now in the middle of the Saturn, Pluto in Capricorn, conjunct the South Node. It is intense. Globally, it's intense while we're watching the news and watching Pluto do its work with Saturn, which is so emblematic of the trials by fire. Pluto represents the fires of death that can burn through the many, many layers of conditioning. In other words, Saturn, okay, that keeps us limited and isolated and that prevent us from experiencing and expressing the passionate fire of divine love, which is embedded in Pluto, which is embedded within our own hearts and our emotional bodies. As Jeffrey Green says, Pluto symbolizes the death and rebirth, metamorphosis, transformation, and regeneration. The process manifests because of limitations or stagnations that are rooted in our old emotional security patterns that are based upon our past and that condition our present orientation. Okay, this is where the South Node projects the past onto the present, and we truly need the bridge to help us, and Mars to help us orient towards the North Node. Okay. So a quote, I love this, by Dane Ruggier. He's been an important source also for me in the information that I've sort of, in my learning, I should say, where he speaks to Pluto. And this is where he says that Pluto registers, and this is a quote, Pluto registers the fact that a time has come for the possibility to move from one level of consciousness and activity to another. He then produces the conditions required for such a passage or transmutation. The more bound the consciousness is to Saturnian patterns and memories, the harsher these conditions. Pluto can be ruthless as well as relentless, what we know as the dark night of the soul or trials by fire. If the soul is ready for the descent, she may, with calm strength, meet the Plutonian processes of total stripping away and the void to which it leads. Such a person carries in her heart the vision of where she is going and no longer resists the transformation, whose purpose she consciously makes her own. She can then become a clear and profound expression of her divine fundamental nature. As Dane Ruggier in The Sun is also a star. So just as we see in nature, it is a cycle of birth, emergence, flourishing, decay, and death, only to reemerge again as a being that is formed by its past and yet carries the vision of its future inside its heart. And with time has the courage to activate the future more and more embodied and as a whole being. As many of you are aware, Saturn is balsamic phase conjunct Pluto in Capricorn, and the South Node is conjunct Saturn and Pluto. This, with the combination of Saturn and Capricorn and Pluto, it is up to us to take the responsibility to make the conscious choices that orient us towards broadening our consciousness rather than reinforcing the limitations and separation that we are so accustomed to. We also need to learn to strip away the expectations that security will be provided by an external authority and avoid projecting these expectations upon others. It is hard. It hits us in the belly where our deepest insecurities lie. I just want to add here that Jessica DeRuzza did a superb job of describing the beauty and the pain of the Pluto-Saturn times that we're in the middle of right now. I recommend that live stream on the Trust Psyche YouTube page. Now in this talk, I'm painting a broader picture, basically the philosophy of the evolutionary process itself. So as we move forward in the evolutionary process, a couple of things I just want to mention. One is the primary ways that Pluto affects evolution in our lives. There are 4 primary ways. I think all of you will be recognizing some of them yourselves in your own experience. We all experience cycles of hell and the heaven with varying degrees of intensity. Okay, so the 4 primary ways. The first is to resist, it's cataclysmic emotional shocks. Okay, by producing emotional shocks in which some behavioral pattern or life situation is forcibly removed from our lives, this process is associated with cataclysmic change and produces an evolutionary leap, so to speak. This situation occurs when we have resistance to the cumulative evolutionary forces to the extent that this effect must occur in order to enforce the required growth. Okay, now I know with your clients and with yourselves, we've all had experiences of cataclysmic shocks. Not to generalize too much, but just to give some examples that comes to mind is, a sudden awareness that a long-term partner or husband or wife wants to divorce or wants to separate or wants to leave. They're done with the relationship. And then to find out that they were having an affair as well. Now, regardless of whether they were having an affair or not, either way, that is a cataclysmic emotional shock. Or one's home catches fire from an electrical storm, and we lose all our pictures, files, computers, family heirloom, jewelry, and furniture are destroyed as well. These are drastic events that occur that create emotional shocks. Okay. The second way of Pluto showing up as the evolutionary impulse when we are being asked to evolve is to form a relationship to something outside of ourselves that we perceive we need. And this is by creating a situation where a new friend comes into our life, a new love, a body of knowledge, going to graduate school, happening upon a book that expands our mind, a new goal that comes into our awareness. Okay, the point being that by forming a relationship to something that symbolizes that which we think we need outside of ourselves, an evolutionary process occurs. And this is scorpionic, ruled by Pluto, where we're merging with something larger than ourselves. By forming a relationship with it, we transform through osmosis. Our previous limitations are slowly transmuted through the relationship. It is a slow yet progressive evolution. Okay. A classic example would be beginning graduate school or joining a spiritual community that involves spiritual training. Okay. So the third is becoming aware of a stagnation or block through an eruption of unconscious contents into conscious awareness. And this could be by producing an awareness that we may not know the why of the material that's coming into our consciousness. But it does create the effect of mobilizing our attention to focus on the block. In some cases, this intense internalization or withdrawal can create catatonia. Okay? That's when we're resisting very intensely to the unconscious material that's coming into our awareness. In other words, the inability to move one way or the other. It takes courage to initiate the change. And this is where it's helpful knowing one's north node, knowing one's moon, which provides the stability, north node, Pluto polarity point, as well as Mars. We are suddenly aware of the block, which allows us to finally take the steps towards our evolution. Number 3 is different than number 2 in that the third one creates cataclysmic events that removes the source of the block through awareness and movement towards transformation. For example, one is suddenly aware that the career path that one has spent 6 years preparing for and then 10 years working in is no longer emotionally or mentally fulfilling and is instead exhausting and draining one's energy, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. Okay, that's where information comes to one's awareness and one is being asked to move on. In many cases, I worked as a career counselor. Many people they feared moving on. They feared letting go of the security of their current position, regardless of how intensely miserable they had become. Okay. So the last one is becoming aware of a dormant or latent capacity. Okay, this is where we become aware of a new capacity or capability that had been latent or dormant. The soul produces or creates a situation in which she or he becomes aware of this new capacity. This takes This takes perseverance, to move in the direction and to develop that capacity. 1 second, I'm going to move backwards. There we go. I think that's where it was, yes. So I know it was. So an example might be getting a new job that had aspects to it that the candidate was not aware of prior to taking the job. This might be a teacher who loves teaching but loses their position due to cutbacks. That could be a cataclysmic event for that person emotionally. But then the person, after a very long time of searching for a new position, is finally accepted into another teaching position. But it is in lower pay because it is in an urban, poor area at a school that has little money. All right. And about 3 months into the position, the current administrator leaves. In other words, the principal leaves. And she is suddenly thrust into a position where she's the administrator of the school. She finds over time that she's very good at it and she enjoys it. Okay, this would be a good example of that. And it's also an example of where oftentimes the way Pluto works, one type of reaction or, sorry, primary way may lead to another one. There'll be oftentimes multiple things within one experience. Okay. So the next one is how we react to the soul and evolution and Pluto. One would be to resist the evolutionary and karmic requirements altogether. Another would be to respond wholeheartedly to the karmic requirements and desire to understand what the lessons are for this life, and then go for it in a totally non-resistant way. And the third would be a combination of the two, which is to be willing to change in some ways, yet resist changing other dynamics because of the fear of the unknown. Okay. As you can imagine, most of us choose the last route, right? So in a chart, you can see where the resistance is due to the stressful aspects, such as the conjunction, the semi-square, the square, the inconjunct, the sesquiquadrate, and the oppositions. The stressful aspects tend to create cataclysmic change. This is because the fears that have kept the issues into our consciousness for all too long, and an event is initiated by our souls to shock it into conscious awareness. Okay. The hard aspects to Pluto in the South Node will give us the information that we need to understand where the fear lies and where the challenges are, right? In the chart, you can also see where the internal strength and support lie as well. And this would be with the semi-sextiles, the sextiles, trines, as well as the septiles, which is 51 degrees, 25 minutes, and the quintiles, which is 72 degrees. The non-stressful aspects tend to create uniform evolution. Pluto symbolizes that which is unconscious and our deepest level of security versus insecurity issues. Even when we are aware of the necessity for change and we are working with the change, Pluto brings the deepest fear forward in us. As Deva Green says, it opens the underbelly. Again, I love that image because that can be what it feels like, very intensely and very overwhelming, because it brings forward that which desires to be healed, but the emotional pain with it must be integrated, and this takes time. The key here is to trust what is happening, embrace it, move forward with as much courage as you can muster, knowing that there is a reason, not an egocentric purpose, but one that extends wider and all the more encompassing, a higher purpose for the change, and the blessings will be received. I have a quote here by Will Keepan, who is a mathematical physicist and an environmental activist. He is trained in transpersonal psychology, but he's actually currently now the director of the Satyana Institute, and he leads retreats and trainings in Washington State on interfaith spirituality. I just love this quote. "The fire of divine love burns on every level of existence, from the heart of the sun to the human heart, to each tiny cell in the human body, to the subatomic particles and the core of every star across all galaxies. It is a grand fractal fire of divine love. There is no force in the cosmos more powerful, and nothing propels spiritual evolution as swiftly as love. Ultimately, love is a transforming fire that burns away everything that is not love." Pluto rules evolution from solar consciousness to galactic consciousness. Now this again, Dane Rugier was very significant in my understanding of this, how Pluto as the planetary archetype furthest away from the sun actually propels evolution from egocentric solar consciousness and a consciousness that is solely focused on one's personal self-identity towards a galactic consciousness, which is centered in an identity that embraces universal consciousness. okay, and all the other self-identities in one's world, in the universe. At its essence, this is the experience and its laws of divine love. Someday, if not now, we will all be immensely grateful for the evolutionary force of Pluto. And of course, I know many of you are so incredibly grateful for Pluto in our charts right now. So, okay, let's see, how are we doing for time? Yes, just over an hour. I am ready for questions. If anybody has any questions, we can open up the floor. I would love to hear any questions or even any if you've got your chart and want to ask about any dynamic between Pluto, your South Node, Pluto, the North Node, Pluto, Mars, I'm happy to to brainstorm with you.
Christina, so this is just very much a natural process, right?
Absolutely, yes. It is the force of life itself, just like we see in nature all around us. And that is the beauty of the evolutionary process, and actually how evolutionary astrology describes it is we see this process, we see it correlated around us all the time through the cycles of the seasons, the birth of a child, the seed, like I mentioned, the walnut seed evolving into the walnut tree, or the oak seed into the oak tree. We see this, a child developing through the many years, and how children develop differently, and yet we see the same structures of development, despite what country they're in, or what culture they're a part of. So very natural.
So do we really need to strive to do anything if it's natural?
Very good question. I love this image of the wave, because I think of like surfing the wave kind of thing. Not that I surf, but as I imagine a surfer, it takes a lot of time and courage to learn how to work with the wave that is coming. The force of the desire that emerges into our conscious awareness. And we all learn from our mistakes. I am an Aries Sun, Aries Mercury. I know so much the Aries dynamic. And what is required is the will, to activate the will, to move forward. And this is where I find evolutionary astrology is so incredibly helpful and enlightening in many ways, is looking to Pluto polarity point, looking to the North Node, looking to the evolutionary dynamic, evolutionary intention as it's represented through the archetypes, as guidance as to where our insecurities are and where to embrace, where it does take courage to embrace the future. And to embrace the new direction. So even though you're right, it is natural, and yet the whole point is we're evolving to become conscious divine beings. And so we have to consciously choose moment by moment, the moon on the bridge, towards our evolutionary intention, in order to be able to eventually to learn how to surf that wave, our desires, and evolution itself as an empowered being. And hopefully, without fear, I'm not speaking for myself, I'm not there yet, but to learn how to be able to turn left, turn right, through pure instinct, and being just completely in alignment with life, with our evolutionary source, and with the divine.
Great. Thanks, Christina. That's a great answer. It's fantastic. Thank you. I think we have a question from Sheila. Please go ahead, Sheila.
Oh. Thanks. Hi, Sheila.
I'm a student of Jaap van der Wal and embryology, and I'm wondering why they started from the time of birth rather than the conception, when there's everything that you're talking about happens morphodynamically in the shaping of the embryo, the polarities, the resistance, the metabolic force fields, it's all there. Mm-hmm. Why don't we start farther back?
That's a very good question, Sheila. I think and please, anybody else, step in, or Sheila yourself, it's just we're not aware of that. We don't know when the embryo actually, when the sperm and the egg, when the sperm, enters the egg, and, our consciousness has not evolved to that point yet, to when we are aware of that. I've known some women who were aware, and I think it probably gives incredible information. But since we are so externally focused in our point of evolution right now, I think the actual, coming out of the womb into this life is the only way right now that we can actually pinpoint the signature of the planets at that time.
I think Randolph Stone, the polarity therapist, has actually had the astrological chart around the developing child. And if we know how many days it takes for a pregnancy, I know it would be iffy, and I know it's a precise timing is important. There's so much that is happening to the child in the consciousness, and so much that's happening with the parents and the grandparents.
Yes.
It's affecting the prenatal development. I mean, it's just a big, potent time that I can see this work being applied to.
I think, the ancestral, the grandparents, the whole ancestral lineage, I do believe it can be seen currently, in the birth chart through the South Node in the moon itself, and anything in the 12th house, for example. So I think we can get information that's really valuable. It would be absolutely fascinating at some point in our awareness if we could find out that meeting point when the seed actually is imprinted in the stars, as well as in that little embryo.
Let me suggest one thing, and I'm not sure if this would be a bastardization of, a violation of boundaries and all that, but if you ever had somebody that was conceived in a test tube artificially, you would know the time of conception.
That's true.
And you might be able to follow that through.
That would be absolutely fascinating. Them allowing an astrologer into the chemistry lab. I don't know when that will ever happen, but we are all evolving. It's just, So Sheila, you're projecting into the future, seeing what could potentially be here.
I'll keep it in my heart and my gathering basket. If I ever find maybe that somebody might know when they conceived or around the time they can actually see that dynamic happening. So if you ever find out, let me know. I'd be fascinated to do the whole process of observation correlation. Okay, printing up both charts, and then really getting to know that life story of that individual and seeing where the correlations are and so on. So it would take probably thousands in order to really see the patterns. But however, we got to start somewhere, and you got to have the awareness to begin with. Yeah. Thanks, Sheila. Awesome. Yeah, Sheila brought up a good point there. It's very interesting.
Okay, do we have any other questions?
I was wondering a bit about when the South Node is either in the 8th house or Scorpio, meaning it would be ruled by Pluto.
Right. That certainly intensifies the process. So if I were to have a client and I see the South Node in the 8th house, I would add the adjective intensity. And yet the intensity of let me explain a little bit more, the intensity of the unconscious security, insecurity patterns. And of course, then I would look to Pluto, which, I will have already evaluated, but that certainly adds a lot more information to that South Node, and all the, the connections of Pluto to the other planets and so on. But it is interesting to have that double signature, to have Pluto and it ruling the South Node. I think I think there's it actually intensifies the resistance as well as intensifies the potential for transformation.
Thank you.
Sure. If anybody else wants to add their thoughts on this, I'm totally open to hearing that. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, Christina, it seems to me that when I go through a Pluto transit, it not only puts me in touch with my soul, but on a much, well, it puts me in touch with the ocean, with universal consciousness. So I guess surrender is very important, but we have the Pluto paradigm, and this is a great astrological paradigm, but what about incorporating a spiritual philosophy into it?
Yeah, and that is the surrender, you know, my will, thy will, divine will, really, because Pluto emerges out of the oceanic waters of the universal consciousness. So I think if you want to add Neptune into this, then somebody is going through the stages of spiritual evolution, which is all integrated. There's no separation between evolution and spiritual versus non-spiritual. It's all spiritual. But to add Neptune to the dynamic, you know, some of the issues that we may run into is some of the Neptunian issues that of forces of insecurity. For example, I have my South Node is in the 12th house, ruled by Neptune. And so there's a part of me that just, you know, probably the first 20 some odd years of my life, I just wanted to be a wallflower. I did not want to, I so feared showing up. So very Neptunian. I struggle with that today, going unconscious, you know, the desire to kind of disappear when things get really difficult, into my imagination, into my dreams, or whether it's drugs or addiction, you know, just the not wanting to be here now. So going through all the different layers of the Neptunian, you know, from the lowest frequency and wherever our seduction points are, getting pulled, you know, this way or that. Everybody's going to have different weaknesses and different seduction points along the Neptunian spectrum. But working through them slowly but surely as one evolves, so that one is more empowered in one's relationship with the divine. And I think ultimately for all of us, it is really about developing a relationship with the divine, as I was mentioning earlier. And that's letting go of external support, going inward and developing the inner connection with the divine, to develop that spiritual support that's deeply within.
Beautiful. Yes, thank you so much, Christina. Okay, so we'll have time now for one last question. Anybody? Okay, Christina, so any final words before we wind down?
No, except for to say that if anybody has any questions later, please contact me. My one regret is not being able to give, you know, to apply it to examples. But I just knew, I've tried this before, and I just knew I would run out of time. And it would, but if anybody has any questions about any specific examples in their chart, please email me, Christina@transpersonalservices.com. I'd be happy to answer your questions, seriously.
Okay, so, Christina, thank you so much for such an excellent presentation.
Thank you, Linda, for the opportunity. I really, really, really appreciate it.
Fantastic. I'm going to unmute everyone now, and would you all please thank Christina Hardy, everyone.
Thank you, Christina.
Thank you
so much. This was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
A lot.
You too.